So first, we wanted to thank all of you for being with us. I know that attendees can't see how many people have joined, but at the moment there are 83 who have already joined us together. And we're really, really looking forward to the conversation today with our speakers, Ruth and Maya, who have been super generous in sharing both their time and their thoughts with us. And thank you to our chair as well, Ludovic Coupé, who my colleague is going to introduce quite soon. So to give you a bit of background, this is just the third of 4 seminars in our series. And to access recordings of our previous 2 seminars and to learn more about our project, you can head to our website, which we're going to put in the chat now. In previous seminars, we did have issues of people not being able to copy and paste from the chat, but that's been fixed. So that should be fine. You should be good to go. If you do have any issues with anything like that, feel free to message us on the chat. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ioana now, who's going to give you a bit more information about this particular seminar's format, as it differs slightly from the previous 2.
Okay, I'll do that again. Thank you, Vi, and hello and welcome to everyone from me as well. I'm Ioana, my pronouns are she, her. I am Mediterranean white with brown hair and brown eyes, and I'm wearing a yellow t-shirt. So the idea behind this particular conversational seminar model, like the one we'll be having today, instead of having 2 separate conversations, has been inspired by the brilliant book of Judith Butler and Athena Athanasiou, Dispossession, the Performative and the Political, where in essence, the whole book is one long conversation between the 2 of them on issues of different forms of dispossession and performance of politics, of affect, recognition, and resistance. So apart from reflecting a bit more accurately the way that we acquire knowledge and information in our everyday, and also when we're conducting research, we think that this reflexive, and we have experienced this reflexive dialectical model also to allow for new thoughts and knowledge to arise during this active exchange. So we're very happy to have Ruth and Maya in conversation tonight alongside Ludo, who's chairing, and we hope that this format will integrally open up to an engaging communal conversation with the rest of us. Emily will now introduce Ludo and share a few words on the focus of tonight's seminar, and then we will start.
Thanks, Ioana, and hello, everyone. So wonderful to have so many people with us today. So my name is Emily Glazer. My pronouns are she, her. As a visual description of myself, I'm a white woman with short, curly brown hair, green eyes, and a blue top and a green scarf. To help frame the evening's conversation, for this seminar, the focus is on the many questions navigated in relationships with participants throughout the multiple stages of ethnographic research. So when speaking of relationships, this seminar takes them in their broadest sense, relations with participants, our positionality, with our research, with the field site community, and the community in which we write as well, all as ongoing. Anthropological methods still hold so many assumptions about these multiple relations. So challenging them brings up questions of intersectional identities, affect, agency, accountability, embodiment, care. Because of this focus, we're especially honored to have Ruth and Maya in conversation today. And I'll now introduce our chair for the evening, who is Ludovic Coupé, an associate professor, at the Department of Anthropology at UCL, where he's been for the past 10 years. From France and half Malagasy, Ludovic was originally trained in archaeology before he turned to anthropology, where his work brings together material and visual culture in Oceania, art and aesthetics among the Abelam, the anthropology of techniques, skills, and materiality, and the anthropology of technology and modernity. Ludovic is a departmental tutor at UCL, a member of the Departmental Anti-Racism Committee, and is currently co-editing a special issue on decolonizing the curriculum. So Ludo, I'll hand over to you, and thank you so much, and we really look forward to this evening.
Thank you very much, Emily. So welcome to all, and it's really a great honor for me to be here and to be sharing this extraordinary event. So first, I am, as Emily has described, I'm half Malagasy, which means that I'm mixed race. So I've got a dark skin, I've got long hair, who are getting grayer and grayer by the month, along with a mustache and a little beard at the end, and I'm brown eye, and I'm wearing glasses, a white shirt, and a sort of creamy waistcoat. My pronouns are he and his. So thank you very much again. So before we start and I introduce the speaker, I would like just to remind you a bit of elements of what is called nowadays the Netiquette. So when the moment of question, and you will see that they will arrive, will come, I will ask you to use the function of raise your hand at the end. I'm going to do so you can see that, which is just at the bottom. Then I will call your name, and Joanna will unmute you, so you will be able to ask your question directly. If you prefer to remain anonymous when you are asking your question, please feel free to use the Q&A function, which is still at the bottom in the middle, Q&A. And then Victoria and Emily will look at the questions and they will read out your question. And as I said, Joanna will unmute you if needed be. Still in terms of Netiquette, we want to remind you that there is no room in this seminar for racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, classism. That's very important, and I'm always puzzled about the fact that that needs to be reminded, but it appears that it is important that we remind you that. We also ask you to be mindful and careful in sense of care with your assumption about the others and the people who are at the event. And then when you ask questions or you make a comment, I want you to think about the effect that can have on the people. So Emily and Victoria, as I said, will be monitoring the event. They will check the question on the Q&A. The series is recorded and will be available on the paper website after the event. And finally, a bit of a warning, the series may include content that you might feel distressing or uncomfortable. We might address the issue of microaggression in our disciplines, intergenerational trauma, or other form of violence as a result of our discipline's position relating to colonial history. So thank you for listening to those elements of Netiquette. Now I'm going to try to present the two speakers tonight in the way that deserves the quality of their work. So I'm going to start with Ruth Bayar, who is a cultural anthropologist. The website describes her as a Cuban-American cultural anthropologist, who is also a poet, a writer, a teacher, and a public speaker, which is quite an impressive series of quality. She's been acclaimed for the compassion that she brings to her quest to understand the depth of human experience. So she was born in Havana, and she has grown up in New York, a place that I wish that I'm going to be able to visit one day, and has lived in Spain and Mexico. She returns often to Cuba to build bridges around culture, literature, art, and Jewish life. So she's published several books about her travel, such as Translated Woman, The Vulnerable Observer, An Island Called Home, and Traveling Heavy. And all have been acclaimed for the mix of the way in which she managed to mix her personal experience, her encounter with a proper scholarly writing, a quality that we should all aim at. She's also author of bilingual book on poetry, Everything I Kept, Todo Lo Que Guardé. I apologize for my bad Spanish accent, on top of a bad English one. Ruth has also made her fiction debut with her autobiographic novel for young people, Lucky Broken Girl, which I'm going to definitely try to acquire. I got seduced by the description, which is a work of historical fiction based on her grandmother escapes from Poland to start a new life in Cuba on the eve of the Holocaust. So that is really, really an amazing, story. She was the first Latina to win the MacArthur Genius Grant, and she has also received the Guggenheim Fellowship and was named a Great Immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. Incidentally, the Lucky Broken Girl, sorry, has won the Pura Belpré medal also. So Ruth is the Victor Aim Pereira Collegiate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So we're very pleased to have you here, Ruth. And the conversation will be with Maya J. Berry, who is an assistant professor of African diaspora studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's a social and cultural anthropologist. She employs a Black feminist and performance-oriented lens to examine what existed movement towards Black self-making in the contemporary post-Fidel era can teach us about the Cuban Revolution, updating economic model, vision for its future, and the embodied articulation of Black political imaginary. Incidentally, while looking for the performance side, I found this this recent performance with student-led project In Gratitude, which was held in Toronto, I believe, in the Power Plant Gallery. Am I correct? Yeah.
In Durham.
Yeah, and that was quite amazing considering that it was during the COVID period. So that's quite an amazing achievement. So among her projects, she also critically interrogate the embodied aspect of conducting engaged research in post-colonial context, which speaks to many of us as anthropologists and ethnographers. And she has theorizing from the specificity of Black women and race relationship in this site of investigation, something that also for some of us can be very resonate. Never been as white as I was in Papua New Guinea, which was quite an interesting shock in a way. This work explores and advances a politically engaged anthropology rooted in Black feminist practice, which I think is absolutely central if we want to do some decolonizing sort of thinking. She has also held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale University. So she's an artist scholar of dance, race, politics, and performance. And we're honored, Maya, with the 2015 Zora Neale Hurston Award from the Association of Feminist Anthropology. So what is absolutely amazing here is both of you embody really both the mixing of personal lives, personal involvement, activism, but also not only the scholarly writing, but also performance, art, poetry, literature. And I really look forward to this event. So may I start with an opening question? How do we relate to our research participants? So feel free to start.
I guess I can start us off. Hi everyone. I just first just
the conversation, so you can just. This is a conversation, so you can just like okay. So and remember, sorry, I should have reminded you to describe yourself visually.
So my pronouns are she, her. I am a dark-skinned Black woman with curly hair going down to my shoulders. I'm currently wearing a white button-down shirt, and I'm in a room with teal walls. And so I was going to respond to this question. I really, I liked it for its, because the short answer would be to say differently and kind of leave it at that, right? But I was thinking about it a little further, and I recall that in many ways, I think it's determined by how we relate to the research endeavor. So what is our understanding of our function or duty as a researcher? What leads us to the discipline, and what we kind of understand our job is to do. And then in addition to that, how we are interpolated in the field, the types of assumptions that are made about our role, and what we're here to do. And I think the mix of those two things is what actually ends up determining how we relate to research, or even if we consider the people that whose lives that share their lives with us in the field as research participants at all. And so, I don't think that this is something that the discipline kind of can train you to do. I think it's something you bring with you. And hopefully you are able to find the mentorship to guide you and give you tools and guide you in that particular orientation. But it's one partly that you bring to it, and the others that's kind of that you're kind of bodied forth into. And then the combination of those things determines what those relationships can be. And so I think that's something that really might be more fruitfully asked of oneself kind of before entering a program, and not think that that's something that I'm going to be taught to do after I'm in one, right? And I'll stop there for nature of it being a conversation, but more thought.
Thank you. I really like this idea of the encounter almost. Ruth?
Yeah, so I guess I should introduce myself as well. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white passing woman with dark brown hair, dark brown eyes. I'm wearing a blouse with a colorful pattern, and I have books behind me. So I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here. I'm so glad to be part of this speaker series and this conversation today with Maya. Maya, I'm sure our paths have crossed in Cuba at some point. And now it's so good to get to meet you in this way virtually. So very excited that our paths are crossing here as well. And yeah, totally. And with regard to the question, I completely agree with you. I think it's a very reciprocal process. I think that, in a way, we as the ethnographers don't decide what the relationship is going to be, but rather the people that we encounter in our field work, to keep calling it field work because it's a useful term, even though it's a kind of a funky term, I think, in this day and age, but we still use that term. It's the people that we encounter that kind of decide what the relationship is going to be as well, or largely, I would say. And one other element that I would add, and it's just because I'm a lot older than you, and you realize as time passes that that your relationship with people also has a lot to do with your age. So when I think back to who I was in my early 20s, working in a village in northern Spain, people saw me as this kind of grandchild that had arrived in this little village because most of the young people had left. Nobody wanted to work in agriculture anymore. And so it was just these elders that were left doing the farming. And then I appeared, I was like 20 or 21, and they just thought, oh my God, this person is so young, we have to take care of her, And so that was a particular relationship. Then as I got older and I was working in Mexico, and by then married, and I was there for 3 years in this town in Mexico, in San Luis Potosí. And there the concern was, how can you be married and not have a child yet? So the women of Mesquitique were just extremely concerned about me and wanted to take me to a doctor and figure out why I wasn't having, why I didn't have 3 children, in the 3 years I had been there. So that was a whole other kind of relationship that I had. And then more recently, as I'm sure we'll talk about now, working in Cuba, where I was born, and going back and forth and reconnecting with my roots and my story in Cuba. I have a whole other kind of relationship there, and how people see me is different because they see me as a Cuban American who goes back. Not every Cuban American goes back to the island. And so they put me in a different kind of category, which has a lot to do with how they view me when I'm doing research about them. So I think these relationships are very fluid and they change over time, and we're always sharing mortality with our subjects, and at different times we're in a different, you know, place in our own mortality, and that has a lot to do with how we're seen and the kinds of relationships we develop.
Right, right. And I'd also, I mean, thinking, you know, piggybacking on what you were saying, it also depends on project to project, kind of the types of, the terms of the relationship might change. So I guess the way that you relate to others is not, like you said, it's not fixed. It has to do with kind of how you yourself are changing as a person, but also the particularities of how the situation kind of puts you under certain types of constraints, or also opens certain types of doors that wouldn't be possible in the abstract, right? So I appreciate kind of the broadness of the question, and also I think it's hard to keep it at that level, but to substantively respond, it really requires a level of specificity, as it should, you know. I was also thinking about how the time of the pandemic in this moment has, I think, brought this question, which seems so elemental, I think, back to the fore as a pressing consideration that people are contemplating, because research was at a standstill for so many because of the ways that we're kind of used to relating in normal times. And so I think it's prompted some really provocative and constructive and overdue contemplation about kind of really these basic questions. I'm thinking about the blog series on the Wennergren put out about doing anthropology in times of COVID, and there was some reflection on that. And I was, the words of one of the contributors, and I might pronounce this wrong, Nolwazi Makwanasi, was particularly getting at this question, which is, you know, why, and which is related, which is why do we do research, and should we be doing research at all, and where should we be doing research, and why? And so I just appreciated that these questions that I'm seeing that are surfacing that require some overdue pause.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It's, you know, it's been a time of rethinking so many different aspects of anthropology as well, the decolonization of anthropology. I mean, there's so much that has needed to be done. And I think this has been a time for a lot of rethinking and conversation, a lot of productive conversations as well. So it's been kind of a useful pause in a way, but then at the same time, I think it's been painful for a lot of us, as you said at the beginning, because we're not engaged in those face-to-face, you know, conversations, doing things with people, being with people, which is so important to the work that we do. And so we've had to find alternative ways to stay in touch, to still feel connected at a distance, especially, you know, complicated in places like Cuba, where, you know, where people don't have those kinds of internet connections to be able to easily stay in touch. And so having to find alternative ways. And I think also keeping in mind that these relationships often for us are long-term relationships. I'm still in touch with people that I, you know, met in Spain 40 years ago, and with their children and grandchildren from that little village where I worked. And so these are also long-term relationships. They don't necessarily stop, you know, after the field work. Like, you might be done with the field work, but you still have the relationship with the people that worked with you and that helped you do your work. So I think that's another part of it. There's kind of the relationship part that happens when you're doing the work. And then there's the relationship part that happens long after the work is done, but you still have that bond and that connection with people, and that continues, that human relationship continues.
May I ask a question? First, there was somebody has raised their hand on the chat, but it's gone, I think. So please, if anyone wants to ask a question, just raise your hand. I just discovered that I could do that. My question was exactly about the long-term relationship, because and the condition in which we are all working in the transformation also of academia. When you do field work in some part of the world, realize that I'm going to talk from my own personal point of view. I had a sense of indebtedness to the people where I did my field work in Papua New Guinea, the village, in the sense that without them, I wouldn't be where I am now. And that's a sense of a debt that I cannot ever repay. And the pain of not being able to go back there as much as we would like, particularly when we do field work away from where we are from. And so how does that sense of indebtedness and the type of affect that it carries, how do you two have dealt with that, or do you think through that? Which part is it? Which part does it occupy in your own work and in your own relation? Maya, Ruth, do you want to start? Anybody?
Oh, please.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very, very important part of our work. It's something I think about all the time. I've written a little bit about it as well, especially in Translated Woman. I wrote about it in some detail. My awareness that I was obtaining this life story from Esperanza Hernandez, who very much wanted to tell her story, but nevertheless, she was allowing me access to this incredible life story that she had. And yeah, it was a very reciprocal relationship where it was important that I affirm her story and that I bring her story across the border, as she often said, para los gringos, she would say to me, take the story across the border so the gringos can read it. And she took a certain kind of pride and joy in that. But I was always very aware that that this was a huge gift, as you said, you called it a debt, that I would never really be able to fully repay. I was writing a book. I was, going to move up the academic ladder. I was going to be giving talks and so on, and really, in a sense, basing myself on this work that I had done with her. And so, the only way I think to repay, and I don't really like using these contractual terms because I think these relationships are so complex, but I think we had a lot of reciprocity. She passed away just a couple of years ago. But I always went back to Mexico, stayed in touch, kept connecting with her. Now I stay in touch with her youngest son. And so I think maintaining that connection and continuing to help in any way you can with things that she needed from the US that I could bring her. So maintaining just kind of the human connection, I guess. But I think in all of these relationships, all of these ethnographic relationships, they can be very unequal. I think they've been different for me now in Cuba, where I've also in Cuba been doing a lot of work with people in the artistic and literary community, and there it's a different kind of relationship. But nevertheless, issues of power and economic inequality and so on, all of those relationships, all of these relationships have some element of that, even when you're working with people that are more closely your counterparts, who are fellow writers or scholars. Nevertheless, you can find yourself in that situation of economic inequality and knowing that the ethnographic relationship isn't going to fix that.
Precisely. Yeah. I would say similarly, part of the way that I think I reconcile that, and perhaps it comes from an awareness that, I think ideally we do this work with the hope that, we're going to that the work is going to further a social justice agenda, or that is going to, by sharing their stories, that it's going to somehow improve the trajectory of their lives, or create different forms of understanding that even indirectly will lead to some change, if not directly. And also we have to come to terms with a reality that we're probably going to benefit a lot more materially from the relationship because of the way that these experiences within our discipline in the academy get transferred or commoditized in this marketplace of ideas to create that are kind of traded and valued for our things like tenure and the like. And so part of, I think, what's really important is to, in the process, and not necessarily thinking about the outcome, but in the process, trying to make that relationship as worthwhile on its own terms, and for both parties. And that's something that can be kind of come to a later question we're going to talk to about the ethics of our research practice, and how we navigate different or create kind of ethical codes. And I think for me, one of the things that was really, that attracted me to a tradition of activist research was this attention to the research process. I mean, at every stage of the research, really considering kind of the stakes or the politics of what you're doing, and trying to make sure that there's something inherently of value for the people that you are working with along the way, right? So you're not just like waiting for, doing all this work and hopefully like history will absolve you, at the end it'll all be worth it. But in the process itself has to be one of integrity and value to the people who's sharing their lives with you. And so that can take the form of, having their agency, or to be able to shape the research questions themselves, so that so they're just as invested in finding out the answers as you are. And so there's already kind of a built-in value added for the research to be completed, because of the way that they've seen their worries and fears and hopes as somehow tied to that, to figuring it out, and that kind of the interpretation of the data, right, that they bring to their lives. And so that can do two things, but that can also, validate the people that we're working with as knowledge producers themselves. And so it's not about, us kind of bestowing our wisdom on them, but honoring them as partners and collaborators in making sense of this thing, which has its own type of value, and that's and I think it also leads to there's an argument that's been made, and I think Charlie Hill has made one, is that it also leads to just more rigorous research, better scholarship. So that's another argument to be made, that has a certain value. So yeah, I think there's definitely a debt, and I think with that debt, we can also think of like the different ways that we can imbue the process with values that perhaps aren't necessarily transferable, but nonetheless kind of have meaning on their own terms, that can make that continuing that relationship seem worthwhile.
Yeah, no, I think that's so beautifully said. I totally agree. And I think that's a really wonderful way to put it, this kind of sharing of the process of knowledge, right? That everybody's invested in this research, right? That this is knowledge that we're going to work on together and to understand together. And as you were saying that, I was thinking back to, to moments in my research when that happened, and it was such a positive thing. And again, over time, I think that sometimes the work that we do, the documentation work that we do, can then be very helpful to the communities that we have worked with. When I think about the work I did in the village in Spain, where I, at the time I was very interested in photography, and I took thousands of pictures. And then over the years, those pictures became, you were talking about value, they became valuable, not in a monetary sense, but valuable very much in a historic and sentimental sense, because I took pictures of people who are now gone, and I took pictures of people working the land in a way that it no longer happens. And so I kind of created an archive, you might say, that I could then pass on to the village. And so then I was able to scan all of those photographs and give them to this wonderful person in the village that I'm still very close to, who created a website for the village, and really loves like everything having to do with the history of this place. And so it's now all archived with the village, along with these historical documents that I used to transcribe and read together with local villagers to understand what their own history was about. So I think that kind of process that you were describing of sharing and working together towards a goal that you want to reach with them, and not a goal that is just your individual research goal, but rather a goal that connects with the people that you're working with. I think that really creates a very beautiful bond.
Thank you. Victoria, I think we've got a question from the Q&A. If you wanna read it, or?
We do, yeah, we do. So this is from someone who's chosen to remain anonymous, and they have asked, what does an equitable or healthy relationship look like with participants? What does integrity mean? It seems like we're talking a lot around the subject, but can you provide some examples?
What does integrity mean?
Yeah. You understand? I mean, Maya, Ruth? I feel that there is almost a philosophical question there, but there is a practical one. No, but there is a practical one indeed. How do we remain intègre? I don't know the word in English while in the field, concretely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I would kind of enter this conversation is through, or what I think of in integrity is I think of a politics, and so there's a way that because of the disciplines, the way that it was formed to do a particular thing, right? To study the savage slot, as Trio would say, is that we have to actively try to counteract that. It's not going to be something that is going to change just by the nature of us being good people, right? But the discipline is meant to do a certain type of work on the other, right? That to actively counteract that, you have to bring kind of a politics of or a decolonial politics to the work. And one of the ways that that I've thought about this I think gets at this really concretely, is by something that is promoted by the Austin School, the approach to the African diaspora, in which I was trained at the University of Texas at Austin, which is to say that research starts with first the politics of identification, right, with the community of struggle, or a collective in struggle for the improvement of their life chances, and then dialogue. And so that is where kind of the story begins and ends, ideally. And I think that having that kind of orientation to the work is that you are going in to to build a dialogue with folks that have their own agendas. And your role is to kind of support and clarify and to use these kind of methods that we're trained in to try to further those goals. And I think that's kind of what kind of orients one's sense of integrity in relation to something concrete, right? And you can kind of measure yourself in relation to how you might be getting them closer or not to that goal. I mean, that's in theory. In practice, it's a lot messier than that. And it's often the case that, you know, the community is not monolithic and they might have differing goals and, you know, or different political agendas in a certain given moment. And so, you know, it's not always so simple to think like I'm going to do what the community wants, because that also, we have to allow them the same level of, you know, humanity that we have, in the sense that they are contradictory and have conflict and inner conflict and internally within the group. And so it gets messy, I think, very quickly. But I think that is something that can be kind of a touchstone to know, you know, with what I'm doing is for what and why. And that has been something that's very grounding in just the projects that I've taken on thus far. And it's also been one of, I mean, I think it's more difficult. I think it's a lot easier to kind of just follow your own, you know, compass, and to kind of leave integrity on the margins, or integrity understood in that way, on the margins of the project. And it's a lot, particularly because those types of systems of rewards are not the same ones that the academy has, you know, for your productivity, right? So those things could actually be at odds with one another. And I think that conflict actually itself is really pedagogical, to realize, you know, when am I rubbing up against the demands of, you know, these people whose lives I've committed to sharing with and advancing their struggle, and when am I rubbing up against the kind of constraints of the academy and the institution, and why might those two things be at odds in a given moment, or why might, you know, my own, you know, personal safety feel at odds with one of those in a given moment, and those kind of negotiations that happen. My own sense of my own, the goals that I kind of came in with into this discipline, when that might be at odds with what I feel called to do on either side. And so it's not to say that, you know, by leading with integrity that then makes things easier. I think it makes things more challenging, but I think we can learn a lot, not just about the other, but about ourselves in the process.
Just before, Ruth, you answer to that question, I want to remind all attendees that you can ask your question. There is not like a conversation, then the question. So you can ask the question, as some of you have already done, as we are discussing. Ruth, do you want to give us your point of view?
I'll just add a little bit, because I love everything you said, Maya, so I'm not sure I can add more, except just to underline everything you said. But I guess I would just add, you know, one more word to the question of integrity, which is respect. I think, you know, we really operate from a sense of respect with and toward the people that we're working with, and it's mutual respect. And I think you earn the respect of the people that you work with by showing the integrity, and the integrity is your honesty and your willingness to be there and to listen, And for me, over the years, one of the things that people would often say is, "Oh, you came back again. You know, we didn't know if we were going to see you again, but you came back." And that actually was a kind of symbol of integrity to people. And I'm talking, you know, about my relations with people in Spain, Mexico, and Cuba, since I live in the US, but I spend a lot of time in these places. And I think sometimes people wonder what, you know, how deep is our connection? And I think when we go back again and say, yeah, no, I still care about you. I still really am interested in what's happening in your lives and in the community. So I think maintaining that sense of truly caring, like you truly do care, and you come to really want to support, as Maya was saying, you know, the struggles of people, advance the struggles of people in different communities that we get to know. So I think respect is really crucial, developing that respect. And I guess this will come up in the next questions that we have, but, you know, but really maintaining a strong ethical relationship as well. And, you know, and if people tell you something in confidence, you know, you're not going to write about that, you know, so there's lots of things that you learn that might be very juicy to write about, but you don't, because, you know, it could hurt a person, you know, it could tarnish a reputation. So you're careful in that way as well. You're careful and you're caring. You wouldn't do anything that would hurt any of the people that are kind enough to be in a relationship with us as ethnographers. So I think you gain that trust, to just use kind of a very classic word from ethnographic fieldwork. You really do gain that trust by showing it to people over a period of time. And then when it comes to writing, I think another important element of this is sharing the work with people as it's developing, as it's unfolding, sharing the ideas with people, sharing actual texts as well when that's possible. And I think, again, you know, the sharing of the knowledge process, but also the process of writing itself, the actual work that's going to circulate, you know, out in the wider world, sharing that as well with people. I think all of those actions are part of our efforts to demonstrate as much integrity as possible at all times in our work.
And I mean, to echo what you were saying, I think it's completely true. I mean, there's so much emphasis on, you know, what we write and getting it out to the public. And I think part of a lot of integrity is the discretion to know what not to write, right? Like what actually, I mean, how many things that I'm consciously don't put on the page because of the respect that I've earned, and that the importance that holds for me. And I think that's what provides like a concrete example of what I was getting at before, when we have kind of the demands of the academy being kind of at odds with the types of relationships of integrity that we have with our the people who share their lives with us. Is that there's a lot of juicy stories that I'm sure would be, people would sop up, right? But these are people's lives who we feel are joined with in this way, and to not exploit that kind of the vulnerability that we've been privy to share by kind of exposing certain things that really, at the end, I mean, the purpose that it would serve would be at odds with the goals and the life chances of the people whom we study. And so that kind of discretion, I think, is a way that we can show our integrity as ethnographers.
Thank you, Ruth and Maya. It resonates with many of the things that I've encountered myself. Victoria, I think that we've got questions from the Q&A, and some of them are directly related, I think.
We do, and just a reminder, you don't have to ask through me. You can raise your hand and speak directly if you'd prefer. So we've got 4 questions right now in the Q&A, and there's 2 of them that I think are quite closely related. So I'll ask them in conjunction with one another. The first is from Caetano Santos, who says, absolutely fundamental insights. I was wondering if Ruth and Maya could address how they see the current conjuncture, as in COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and the way the pandemic is deepening inequality, affecting in specific or general ways the ever-present issue of power imbalances in fieldwork relationships, especially considering race and ethnicity. And then there's another question that's been posed by Asta that I think is quite related to this one. And she says, or he says, I apologize, would you have thoughts on how one can be an ethical anthropologist when we're studying powerful communities and groups, those that have been historically more powerful and continue to use systems to oppress? How does collaboration work then? I realize that this is complex and I would appreciate your thoughts.
Who wants to start on that? I mean, I think that the question of the current situation on the Black Lives Matter and the COVID and the pandemic and etc. and all the inequality that it has revealed is quite an interesting situation, even though we might not have completely the distance to really reflect upon that, because it is still an ongoing process. But I'm very curious to see how you think we might start thinking about these.
Maya, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I mean, I guess one of the second question seemed to invoke Laura Nader's piece about studying up. And if I'm interpreting the question correctly, it's about studying those that are in positions of power that are doing the oppressing and how to navigate those types of relationships with integrity. And I think that work is so important to be done. The idea of studying up, I think it's important, like Laura Nader says, is to really get behind the facelessness of those who wield power over so many, and instead of asking a question of why are you suffering, and instead to ask a question of why do you have so much, or why are you so well, or how are you, and it's kind of the inverse of where we kind of put our attention is on those at the bottom, and the idea of centering the marginalized, but then that also kind of leaves off the hook how they got there in the first place, and the kind of affective investments of those in power and in maintaining these systems of oppression, which I think is really important to critically interrogate with as close of an eye, or else we're only kind of getting half of the equation. And I think there's differing abilities of those of us to be able to do that work well. And I think because of, again, how we relate to those in the field, and there's certain access that I know I won't have because of the way that I look and who I am, that is going to prohibit me from being able to research in the certain communities, right? But I think for those that can, it's very necessary to kind of use that positionality to do the work that not all of us can. And I've seen really great examples of this. I think in the time of Black Lives Matter, I think it's connected to the, like rightfully so, Victoria said, I think those two questions are connected, because I mean the stakes, the life and death stakes are so blatantly clear. The death toll is just the grotesque mundanity of the way that certain lives are disproportionately death bound is sickening, to the point where we have to ask ourselves, kind of as a discipline, is what does that call upon us to do? And I think I think it's understandable to be called to orient your work in a way that is going to lend focus to those kind of roots of misery that we see on a quotidian basis right now. I also don't think that this is necessarily anything new. So in a way, I mean, the systems that have led folks to die, since COVID were the same ones that were set up from before, right? And so it's a little curious that there's somehow this kind of revelation that now, it's really time to do something. And I think that's also something to be suspect of, is kind of where the urgency, the awakening to urgency comes from, and kind of who has the privilege to be surprised or awakened. Like, for whom is this a revelation? And for whom does this an impetus is also, I think, something that should be critically interrogated. Those are just kind of initial thoughts, but I would want to also, lead us to get to a place where I'm also wary of kind of the impulse, the liberal impetus to position oneself as a savior. The anthropology's relationship to colonialism, of the white man's burden to and that kind of function of understanding the natives so that we can better control them. I think it's the logics and the libidinal drive of the white savior complex is not very far off from those, that same logics. And so the idea that, now we need to go save others, there should be some pause before taking that jump. And instead, I think it might be more useful to think about, how does the current conditions reveal the function of the state and our own relationship and complicity in those systems of oppression, but also how we are all kind of dying slowly. And so the work is not necessarily to be suddenly change our project to save someone else, but also to understand that our own liberation and our own ability to thrive is joined, right, with this kind of collective suffering. And so I think that type of calling to the work, I think, is a different, has a different quality to it. And yeah, these are my initial ideas, but I'm going to continue to flesh them out. I don't know if, Ruth, any of that resonated.
Thanks. Before I give the mic to Ruth, I want to remind all attendees that you don't necessarily have to, those who don't want to ask an anonymous question, you can also raise your hand and we will give you the microphone. So Ruth, you want to answer to that? And then after that, Emily, I think, has a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, I won't add very much because Maya, I think you really did say it all. Maybe just some very minor things I could add that I've, on a very local level, I've seen the changes in the anthropology department at the University of Michigan, where I teach, and the conversations that we are having now, and of course having them over Zoom, not in person, but that started, over the summer, when typically we never talk to one another because everybody's off doing their research, but we all knew that we were not going anywhere, and we were having conversations about Black Lives Matter. We were having conversations about needing to decolonize the discipline yet again. You know, we've tried to decolonize it several times. It's like, we need to decolonize the discipline. We were, you know, we were having discussions about the curriculum. We were having conversations between faculty and students that we had never had before, like all of us together, you know, in this virtual space. And so, you know, as you said, it was this awakening. And of course, the awakening is a sign of privilege, that those who can be awakened, you know, are already privileged. But it was a real mix of people. And for me, it was very interesting to watch my white male colleagues kind of confront questions that it seemed to me that they had never quite been pushed to confront in the same way about their own positionality. You know, the students were asking them to think about, well, what brought you into anthropology? You know, what were you seeking? And like so many of them were thought that they, you know, it was the liberal thing. Like they thought like, well, I'm a critic of my society, so I'm going to go elsewhere where I'm sure there's a better society, you know, than there is in the United States. And then, you know, realizing like how twisted, you know, that thinking was, and so on. So I think it's led to some good conversations, which hopefully will lead to some real change. So I think the one positive thing, you know, for anthropology is that if this has led to some conversations that can change the discipline and bring it, you know, into a more liberatory system, you know, that it has the great potential to be, I think that's a really positive thing. And then the other thing I want to mention is creativity, I think, has been huge during this time of the pandemic. And we've seen it again on many different levels. There was a group of people that got together, and a group of ethnographers who wanted to write flash nonfiction. And we all got together and wrote these very short 750-word pieces, a lot of them about issues of race and class and the changing planet and the pandemic and so on. And so it brought us together to do something creative. And, you know, there's been a lot of information about that, all the creativity that this awful crisis has engendered, good creativity, not, you know, not trivial creativity, but creativity where you see human beings reinventing themselves in more positive ways. Or I think of things like some of the children's books that I'm now familiar with because I'm writing for young people, but you think of Anti-Racist Baby, you know, Kendi's, you know, book, which has been, you know, so amazing and gotten people to think about, like, you know, small children need this book. They need to learn about these issues. And so there's been creativity on different levels. It certainly doesn't respond completely, as you said, to all the suffering and the inequality and so on, but it's a good step forward, I think. And so I wanted to just point to that as something that we can look forward to, as hopefully something that will engender, you know, positive change socially, social justice changes, but also positive changes in how we think. Which is what we're engaged in the academy. So how can we think differently and think more considerately and more compassionately and more vulnerably? I think those kinds of changes will be good.
Yeah.
We
I
only,
think that's
sorry,
true
we
that
just,
sorry.
yeah, we only have 10 minutes left officially, but and we have a couple of questions. So yeah. I'm really sorry about that. I want to stay more to.
Can we just hear Maya's response?
Yeah, that's what I was about
curious.
to say. So,
yeah.
Maya, you can respond to that.
I was, you know, thinking back to the discussions that have been popping up in anthropology departments over the summer, and I think it's true that is a phenomena of the summer of 2020. How much dialogue was happening in anthropology departments, and particularly around the piece of that Ryan Jobson put out about "Let Anthropology Burn," and I think was just such a timely release during this summer when the wildfires were happening on across the country, not just on the West Coast, but also in the protests that were happening across the country in response to the police violence against Black people. And I think there's a lot of generative conversations that were begun that perhaps were overdue. And then I was also struck by the resistance to those conversations and the types of yeah, I'd say resistance to those types of challenges and provocations, and the investment in kind of the sanctity or the liberal conceits of anthropology, and that was kind of just as telling. So I think both of those things were showing up at the same time.
Thank you. We're discussing. I think we're going to overrun. Because this is such an amazing session, and there is a lot of interesting questions. So unless Ruth and Maya, you've got commitments, we can go a bit further. Emily, do you want to ask the question?
Yes, thanks, Ludo. So this is a question that actually nicely leads on from what Ruth and Maya were just talking about, and it's from Nora in the Q&A, and she analyzing ethnography.
I missed that. I think it got frozen for me.
Yeah, Emily's internet is a bit patchy, and I think the question was, how do creative methods feature in decolonizing ethnography? Thanks, Emily. Sorry, did you hear me?
How do your creative methods?
How do creative methods feature in decolonizing ethnography? I think that refers to the fact that you are both a creative writer or performer or something like that. So I think it's a very interesting question about that creative dimension of your method and your work.
Ruth, I'll let you take that one.
Okay. Well, I could go on for a long time with that question. I mean, I've been trying to use creative methods in anthropology since I started, and that has included film, writing, and yeah, I guess film and writing mainly, but writing in different genres, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, memoir as well, and a documentary film. And I think just on a very basic level, I'm just trying to reveal more of the complexity of what it is to be human. And I think creative methods allow us to show that complexity in more interesting ways than say a typical, academic piece might. So for me, it's been about trying to show more complexity, more nuance, more aspects of how a person makes their life meaningful. And also, I think the other issue that we didn't get to talk about that much, and that's the question of access and making our work accessible to others. I think that's another important part of decolonizing and democratizing anthropology for all. I mean, now having written a novel called Letters from Cuba that is set in a small town in Cuba called Agramonte, where there's actually a very, very large presence of Afro-Cuban religion and tradition and dance and bata drumming and so on. And I did a lot of research there, but then I decided to write that story as fiction and mix it with the story of my maternal grandmother immigrating to Cuba on the eve of the war and finding life in Cuba at a time when life was close to ending in Poland. So I felt that there were things I could say that I've always felt that there are things I've wanted to say that are poetic about anthropology. I think there's a lot of poetry about our relationship with places and people, and I felt I needed to create a space for myself to speak some of those poetics of the ethnographic process. And so that's led me, on the one hand to fiction, on the other also to actually writing poetry. And I think it's just another way of telling stories. I think that's important. And I think the access part is important. I think now I want to share some of my ethnographic insights with young people, so that somebody who's 10 years old, can read my book, as well as somebody who's an adult. There's something kind of wonderful about that, about expanding the access, expanding the audience, and making our work comprehensible also to the actual subjects that we work with. And so I think creative methods can be a way of just creating more of that equality in the work that we're doing.
I think we've got a question from the attendees. So, Mausumi, if you want to speak, I think somebody has to unmute you. If I can ask you if you are willing to put your camera and or give a visual description when you ask your question.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the lovely session, actually. This is Mausumi. I'm from India. I am based in The Hague with the International Institute of Social Studies. So my question is, I actually, it's not a question, but I would like the panelists and everybody to kind of discuss on guilt. I'm calling it guilt. Maybe there is another better academic word for that. But basically what I mean is when we do ethnographic fieldwork for long in our own home bases, like for example, I'm from India and I'm doing my fieldwork very close to my hometown. Where do we place our personal rights versus professional ethics, in terms of when you know that your class and identity questions are very starkly different from the community members? How do we place ourselves in that scenario, especially if you want to have long-term relationships with community members? Yeah, that's something I would like the panelists to kind of discuss on.
Guilt. Who wants to start?
Maya?
So I do my research. Sorry, my research is in the context of disasters mostly. That's just background. Sorry.
Yeah. One of the things that I've really appreciated about Bianca Williams' work on radical honesty, I think might be a way to enter or to respond to this question, not thinking not just about guilt, but the types of emotions and feelings that one experiences when these kind of racialized and gendered and all the ways that we are positioned in our context kind of come up for us as feelings, as emotions, and the importance that she places on truth telling in her formulation of radical honesty, and how that truth telling about those that kind of affective register can build a bridge to connect the dots to institutional and systemic analysis. And I think that's where those feelings should not be buried, but should be you should kind of taking care of them and paying attention to them as trying to tell us something, and perhaps it's trying to tell us an answer to a question we weren't intending on asking. A question, right? And I think that's where kind of the conflict comes up, is because there's information in that register that kind of leads us to a certain kind of knowledge production, or can lead us to a really interesting and important findings that might be actually more salient than the thing that we had intended on kind of getting the answer to. And so that, I mean, she talks a lot about how shame operates in the academy. It's not exactly guilt, but there's a piece, a chapter that she wrote that's about the relationship between kind of the psychic violence of racism and shame in the academy, particularly. She's talking about the case of Black women, and how kind of the personal narrative is a way of processing that shame and to lead to a kind of a more acute understanding of these systems that bring us to feel this way. And I think that's a way of kind of making the personal generative. The trick is that, you know, we have to give ourselves kind of permission to tell the truth about how we feel. And sometimes that's even hard. It might not even be for a public audience, but the hardest audience might even be just for ourselves. Admitting that and not letting it kind of fester, but really seeing that as information that we are a finding of itself, that maybe we didn't intend to find, but that there's something about it that leads us to a kind of a greater understanding of the systems and the situations that we are that we find ourselves in. And I don't know if that's...
Ruth, maybe you can answer. And after that, we've got a question that has been posed on the Q&A that I think relates well from some time ago. The question relates well to what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think just the only thing I would add is to be aware that there are many different intellectual genealogies in anthropology. And sometimes we only focus on a few of those genealogies and construct our intellectual canons from just a few works, but there's a long tradition of doing work at home, kind of home-based anthropology or homecoming anthropology. And, you know, you think of writers, at least in the American tradition, like John Gwaltney, who wrote an incredible book called Dry Long So, which subtitled The Self-Portrait of Black America. And it's a series of conversations that he had with people, many of whom, as he states in the book, had known him since his birth, you know, so people who knew him very well and that he knew very well in the northeastern part of the United States. So that work is so crucial for understanding one's relationship with a strong relationship with the community as Gwaltney had, or Barbara Meyerhoff, who wrote a book called Number Our Days back in the 70s that was about a small Jewish community in Venice, California. And she writes a lot about, she agonizes about certain issues like, you know, is this personal work that I'm doing or is this research? And she asks a lot of interesting questions about that. Jose Limon, wonderful anthropologist as well, Dancing with the Devil, also kind of, you know, being in a community that you know, has known him since always and that he knows them, and really addressing these questions of insider-outsider relationships, which are really true across the board in anthropology. The thing is that we've inherited, you know, that kind of colonial self-other model, but in fact, the model we should always have, whether we're working with people who know us well or people that we get to know, is really a model of self. And, you know, and I think that that in the work that you're doing, you have the amazing opportunity to really think about those issues and maybe to come back and rewrite the classic essay by Kiran Narayan, How Native is a Native Anthropologist, and to just, you know, come back to that question of a native anthropologist and what does that mean? She was calling for hybridity as a very important part of our positionality as ethnographers. And I would urge you to go to Narayan's piece and think about how to write it for today, how to rethink it for today, and in terms of the work that you're doing would be really fascinating.
And I just wanted to jump in. I know we're closing now, but because you said that your research is on violence, I wanted to bring up just the rigorous attunement to the affective register as epistemology, and apply specifically to the contradictions and dilemmas of Black and Indigenous political life on the ground, invokes a rich hemispheric legacy of feminist ethnography. And I mean, my research is in the Americas, so my reference points are looking at, Black feminist anthropology, the edited volume by McLaren, Keisha Comperi working in Brazil, Krista Craven and Donnie Davis, Black feminist activist in anthropology, but also from the Global South, Leva Solano, Lynn Steffen and Shannon Speed, right? So these are women that are working in with communities in struggle under conditions of extreme violence, that are really honing the affective register as a way of understanding, as a form of knowledge production in furthering those struggles. So you're not alone. There's a rich legacy outside of perhaps the canon that we can go to.
Thank you very much, both of you, for these answers. Joanna, I think we've got a question from the Q&A.
We do. It's kind of question in reverse a little bit on some difficulties we encounter with research participants. So the anonymous question or attendee says, wonderful conversation, thank you very much. We speak of encounters and research participants in a romanticized way. I'm sure this is built on beautiful encounters, but how can we talk about bad encounters? Research participants can be mean, sexist, racist, homophobic, disrespectful, etc. And this brings into place very uncomfortable encounters and emotions, sometimes even harming the researcher. While we still maintain our value and goal to do the research, to visibilize the stories of these people in the hope of doing something that goes in the direction of making their lives better, we live a very uncomfortable tension with other values we have as a person. Have you ever dealt with this? And how would you speak about it, write or communicate it beside a personal research diary, without having the feeling of guilt of exposing a bad image about people, especially when they are a stigmatized minority? So to provide context to this person's question, they do research with refugees in Western Europe.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Who wants to start? Ruth, maybe? Or...
Oh, I was hoping Maya would start.
No, I mean,
count on Maya to be eloquent about difficult topics. I mean, I guess, one quick answer I would give is usually if people are nasty, I don't really want to hang out with them very much. They would probably intimidate me. But on the other hand, I would say, and I don't think this is truly an answer to the question, but when I worked with Esperanza Hernandez on Translated Woman, she was a person who in the town was considered to be aggressive and an improper woman, and she was disliked and considered a witch. And I was a little scared of her because I'm really a kind of a timid, shy person. And I like really kept my distance from her, and I never thought that she would become the subject of my ethnography, that I would write an entire book about her. I really just said, I better not get too close to this person. I don't think I'm going to be able to handle her. She was so different from all the other women in the town who were indeed timid and not forthcoming and not angry. She was angry about patriarchy. She was angry about inequality. She was angry about how she was seen. She was angry about how her former husband had treated her. She had a lot of rage, and I wrote about that. But initially, I really kept a lot of distance. But then I got to know her. She approached me. I approached her. It was an interesting process, and then it turned out that in a way she was a kind of organic feminist intellectual, really kind of criticizing the system in this town where she lived. But it took me a long time to understand that, and I'm glad that I finally got over my fear of interacting with her. So I guess that's a case where you can actually move from being intimidated or thinking I'm not going to deal with this person, and then actually finding that there's somebody there who can teach you so much as she did.
Yeah.
Thank you. Maya?
And I mean, we're very close to the end, so I would say, and this is a loaded question, and I think a very important one. And I have done some writing about this topic with a collective of women of color feminists coming out of the Austin School, and I'd referred to a piece called "Toward a Fugitive Anthropology, Race, Gender, and Violence in the Field," which was in Cultural Anthropology in 2017. And that work really does get at this very question of, when you are in kind of political alignment with the community and struggle, and yet in those spaces, as particularly in my position as Black women, being subject to the very same kinds of violences that we seek to dismantle, and then how do you kind of reconcile your relationships in the field because of the way in which your own kind of body has been put on the line and made vulnerable, and so that kind of dilemma where you're, particularly when you kind of see yourself as a role as one of a politics of solidarity and alignment, and then having to, on the other hand, kind of reconcile with these your own vulnerability in those spaces can lead to a lot of distress and a lot of shame and a lot of silence. And those are the very same silences that these communities are being oppressed under. And so I feel like it's a really sensitive, but a really potential liberatory moment of recognition of kind of our shared condition, and really brings home this idea that you're not there to save anyone, but actually our fates are joined. And when you can understand the yourself as, it's a moment when you understand yourself and your suffering as deeply tied to the object of study, but then how to negotiate that interpersonally, but politically is a really messy situation. But I think this is something that it forms the basis of our continuing work together, and we're working on an edited volume on this topic, and I just hope that you'll continue to do work, but also to write about it in a way that feels safe to you, right? And realizing that kind of taking care of yourself isn't at odds with the politics of the research, but instead it's an extension of it. And that finding has been really generative for me in the work that we're doing in that collective together ongoing.
Thank you very much, both of you. Unfortunately, we're coming to a close because some of us have to move into other pastures. And it has been really, really fascinating, at least for me, and I'm sure for many of the attendees. And I would like to extend my apologies for those of you who asked questions and those questions haven't been addressed. Before I hand it over to Victoria, who's going to announce for the next panel, I just want to add something. What I'm going to take away from this discussion, this fantastic discussion, is often we talk about, particularly in decolonizing the anthropology or decolonizing curriculum, we talk often about positionality as being a sort of a key word. Sometimes I almost want to talk about a buzzword, but what you two have demonstrated is how positionality is indeed a sort of really a personal engagement, effective and moral, and I'm not using the term ethic here, it's ethical, of course, because also ethics, we have ethics forms to have signed off before we go into the fieldwork. So I like to think about really the deeply personal engagement and relations that we are building, which are affective, which are intellectual, which are deeply emotional, just like for me coming back from the field. I remember people were telling me, oh, what a culture shock. I said, no, it's not a culture shock, it's an affective shock. I was missing the people in the field. I even, you know, almost had ghosts of my friends gone back here and we've been just walking in the green field of Norwich on the campus. I thought that they would work there. So all those political and personal involvement, I think that's what make the job that we're doing something which is really enriching and complex, brings a lot of affect. And I think that's one of the great things of what anthropology ethnography is about. So I thank you very, very, very much, Ruth and Maya, and I would have loved to continue that discussion all through the night with drinks and food and merriness, but alas, Zoom doesn't allow us that. So Victoria, I hand it over to you to close. And again, thank you very much for all who have asked questions, for the organizers, and for Ruth and Maya for their kindness and warmth, addressing all those questions, personal questions.
Thank you, Ludo. And I echo everything that you've just said. I've been furiously writing notes as you've spoken, and I'm so glad that this is recorded so I can watch it again. So thanks again for this conversation. It was fantastic. And I want to welcome everyone that's in attendance to our final seminar out of the series, which is going to be on Tuesday. And normally there's a 2-week break between, but you know, with Easter break and all that coming up. It's coming quite quickly. So it's Tuesday the 16th at 5 p.m. GMT. So it's an hour earlier than what we're used to. That is also going to be in a conversational format like this one was. And I'm just going to read the bios of those speakers for you now. We're going to be joined by Professor Elena Fidian-Qasmia and Dr. Julia Salma to discuss the ethics and politics of representation. So Elena Fidian-Qasmia is Professor in Migration and Refugee Studies at the Geography Department at University College London, or UCL, in the UK. She's the co-director of the UCL Migration Research Unit and is the founder and director of the Institute of Advanced Studies Refuge in a Moving World Research Network across UCL. She's currently leading a large number of research projects, including one named Local Community Experiences of and Responses to Displacement from Syria, aka Refugee Hosts, and another named Southern-Led Responses to Displacement from Syria. With Yusuf M. Qasmia and the Badawi Camp Cultural Club, Elena is also joint lead of the Badawi Camp Lab as part of the AHRC Network Plus program entitled Imagining Futures Through Unarchived Pasts. With a particular focus on the Middle East and North Africa, and drawing on a critical theoretical interdisciplinary perspective, Elena's work contributes to key debates surrounding refugee-led and Southern-led responses to forced migration and to the politics of knowledge production vis-a-vis displacement. Julia Salma, on the other hand, is a Brazilian, British, and deaf anthropologist whose research offers ethnographically rich and politically nuanced studies of collective life maintained within and against violent legal, political, and relational structures. She has worked in metropolitan and frontier contexts in Brazil with street children and educators, and with Amazonian quilombolas, or Maroons, on race and ethnicity, political cosmology and ecology, myth and memory, kinship, gender, and the body. Her monograph, which is in preparation at the moment, recounts Quilombo families' corporeal and conceptual efforts to maintain a vital collective life in the face of and against anti-Black ideologies and state-endorsed environmental destruction in the Brazilian Amazon. Julia's work also reflects on personal experiences of racial, gender, and disability discrimination, and the importance of miscommunication in the making of anthropological knowledge. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Joanna now, who's going to give you a bit more information and finish up.
Thanks, Victoria, and hello again. So on the following and final paper seminar on the ethics and politics of representation, we will explore questions such as, what do we choose to include in our written work and what to exclude? How do these choices affect the academic representations of the worlds we create? Where is it important to maintain secrecy? Where might it do harm? How can we acknowledge our political positionality during data collection, writing, and dissemination? What responsibilities do we have towards our research participants? And who do we write for? Elena and Julia in conversation will be joined by Dr. Rick Adrians as chair, a member of faculty at UCL Anthropology and also of the Anti-Racism Committee. Tickets are available through Eventbrite and through our website, the link to which is being put in the chat now. On a final note, we keep asking those that are able to donate to Free Black University, a project that redistributes knowledge and acts as a space of incubation for the creation of transformative knowledge in the Black community. Whilst every contribution is welcome, we strongly encourage those on a fixed salary beyond minimum wage to donate at least 10. To access more information and make a donation, please follow the link in the chat. So once again, thank you to Ruth, Maya, Ludo, Alice, Charlie, and everyone helping to make these seminars happen, and to everyone attending for yet another wonderful conversation. Have a good evening or rest of the day, and we're looking forward to being rejoined with some of you on Tuesday.